This is the video for my Learning Log 4, and it will go from pages 41 to 61 in my table of contents. So on page 41, it starts out with a set of rational numbers, and it goes on with the definition of a ratio and the part-to-whole concept and area model, and the number line model and the set model. And then on page 43, it goes on to division concept and ratio concept and the equality of fractions and the definition to that. And then to the side, I have my examples of equal fractions. And then moving on, the fundamental rule for equality of fractions and the property fraction, improper fraction, ordering rational numbers with like denominators, and explaining how. And then on page 45, we have the unlike denominators and the explanation of how, and there's an example of unlike denominators and finding the greatest, which fraction is the greatest, and some unlike numerators and denominators, and there's an example of unlike numerators and denominators. And then moving on, it describes cross multiplying. And over to the side, there's some examples of cross multiplication when determining which fraction is greater. And then at the bottom, defensiveness of rational numbers and finding equal fractions. And then there's an example of a fraction equaling out. And then on page 47, it starts with addition, subtraction, estimation with rational numbers, and it goes on with the area model, the number line model, and then the area model with unlike denominators. And then toward the side, there's an example of the number line model and also the area model and finding that. And then it moves on to describe mixed numbers and the definition of mixed numbers and how to add them together. You add the whole parts and then the fractional parts. And there's an example of adding with mixed numbers. And then it goes on to the additive inverse property of rational numbers and the definition and the addition property of equality. Then on page 49, the subtraction of rational numbers and the definition and when estimating rational numbers. And here is an example of subtraction of rational numbers. And then an example of estimating fractions. Then it goes on to multiplying fractions, multiplying by paper folding, a fraction times a fraction. And here's an example from my activity book of a fraction times a fraction using the blocks. And then you making connections. And then on page 51, it moves on to algorithm, dividing factors, and some examples, the area model. And then over to the side, there's some examples of dividing, how many 1/12 are in 36, some examples of dividing. And then it moves on to decimals and what a decimal is, the definition, and how you read decimals and pronounce them. And then over to the side, I just have the chart. And then on page 53, how you represent a decimal number, how to change a fraction to a decimal, model models for decimals using the number line, equality of decimals, placing them in order, and then at the bottom it goes on to explain terminating decimals and the definition of a terminating decimal. And we just have an example up here of writing a decimal in expanded form, and then a little number line of decimal numbers. And then on page 55 we have converting fractions to decimals and some examples, and division by terminating, and there's an example over here of division by terminating. And then operation with decimals, adding decimals, using algorithm, and subtracting decimals. And then over here we have an example of adding decimals and subtracting decimals from my activity book. Then on page 57 we have multiplying decimals, using repeated subtraction, decimal greater than 1 times a decimal, dividing decimals, and when the divisor is a whole number and when the divisor is not a whole number. And over here we just have another example from my activity book of multiplying decimals, and then down here of dividing a decimal by a whole number. And then on page 59 we have it continues with the algorithm of dividing, and then it starts with non-terminating decimals and the definition, and what the bar and the dots indicate on a non-terminating decimal, and how to find the fraction of a terminating decimal. And then on the side we have some examples of terminating decimals, and then how to find the fraction from my activity book. And then on page 61 again, how to write them, terminating decimals as a fraction, and division by repeating. And then another example from my activity book, and then another example, and